The story of Crimean Tatars is largely unknown in the West, which is, I think, Beth, so tremendous that you showed this story. Natalie, what do you think? Why do you think this story is so important? Why do Americans, Europeans, people around the world need to know the story of Crimean Tatars?
I think there are two primary reasons. One, the history of the Crimean Tatar people shows and proves Russian colonialism for hundreds of years. If you think about the fact that Catherine II, in essence, occupied Crimea in 1783, and the ethnocide, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing started then. Crimean Tatars made up 80% of the population, and by 1900, 25%. And then there's Stalin's deportation, which is shown in the film in 1944. And if you take this all the way through to Ukraine's independence, the collapse of the Soviet Union, 2% of the population is Crimean Tatar. So we've gone from 80% to 2%. This is an effort to Russify, an effort to change the names of every street, to destroy the culture, to destroy any remnant. And when today Putin says he's taking back what's his, there's no truth to that. The second reason I think it's important to know about the Crimean Tatars is because Ukraine is a multi-ethnic, multi-faith state. If you were at the forum today and you listened to our defense minister, he is a Crimean Tatar of Muslim faith. And you all know our president, who's born of the Jewish faith. Ukraine is the antithesis of what Russia presents. It is a free country, a country where you're free to speak in your language, to live your religion, to be who you are. And that's not the story that Putin tells. He tells a story of Nazis who don't allow for anything. If you understand language, Jamala spoke English, she spoke Ukrainian at times, and at times she spoke Russian. And with her children, she was speaking Crimean Tatar at times, 4 languages. That's the truth of Ukraine. And so I think there are 2 reasons that this is a microcosm of everything we need to know.
Natalie, Crimea, again, is very much part of the equation, both in terms of the battlefield and what we've seen in the Black Sea and the way a country with no navy has been able to decimate the Black Sea Fleet, which is stationed in Crimea. And also, when we talk about the negotiating table, I think often the subtext in the conversations in the West is kind of Crimea kind of falls off the negotiating table, right? Like, well, it's not really possible to win it back militarily. You know, the population is heavily Russian speaking. Let's just kind of leave it or punt on it for a decade or 2. Why is it important that that not happen?
I think the Ukrainians feel the exact opposite, that Crimea is part of any victory. And the reason I say that is it holds multiple important elements for Ukraine. First of all, no Ukrainian can talk about which part of their country they're going to allow to remain outside of Ukraine. And that's because international law has to be at the beginning and the end of all of this, the UN Charter. It has to be territorial integrity, because if that principle falls away, there's no end. If that practice, where might equals right, is what remains after this war, then I worry for all of us. Whether you're in Africa, whether you're in Asia, whether you're looking at Taiwan, that principle cannot stand. The second reason is that Crimea actually needs Ukraine. Crimea, even in those days when it was the Crimean Khanate, relies on Ukraine. It's contiguous with Ukraine. It's not contiguous with Russia. It is arid land without the irrigation from the Ukrainian territory, the mainland territory, the Dnipro. And it is incredibly important for Crimea to be part of Ukraine. When Khrushchev decided to, quote unquote, give it to Ukraine, the reason was because it had turned into an untaken care of part of the country, and he felt that Ukraine would be closer and be able to take care of it. The third reason is what you mentioned, which is for Ukraine, the Black Sea is critical for both its economy and its military security. From an economic standpoint, there are ports on the Black Sea that are reachable from Crimea, if Crimea is in Russian hands, that are incredibly important for the Ukrainian economy for export.
Which we saw during the blockade. Right?
Exactly. And it means not just food for the world, but metallurgy and more. And it means a lot with regard to the Ukrainian economy. So the Black Sea being safe for Ukraine, which it is today, because Ukraine has, as you said, amazingly pushed the Russian Black Sea fleet out, is critical. I think the next reason is what I talked about earlier, which is it's not Russian. It belongs to the Crimean people. It belongs to the Crimean Tatars. And the Crimean Tatars from the beginning have been loyal to Ukrainian territorial integrity. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, Crimea, even with its Russified population, voted in favor of Ukrainian independence, over 50%. And the last reason is because what's happening in that occupation is undescribably awful. And the Crimean Mejlis, which is their form of government, their parliament in essence, has been arrested. People are being tortured. People are being killed. And this is another genocide happening all over to people who've been through, what you just saw. I think for me, one of the things about this movie that's amazing is when she sings 1944. You don't have to understand the words to feel the pain. And that pain happening again and again, happening throughout Ukraine. But I think the fact that you cannot leave it as it is, and the Russians have shown throughout history, again, not just now, not just Putin, not just the Soviet Union, but since 1783 at least, that their intent is to wipe out the indigenous people. You cannot have victory without Crimea. So I'll just add that because the Ukrainians have already once damaged the Kerch Bridge, the Russians have moved a lot of the military purpose to the ferries. Now the Ukrainians are hitting the ferries. And I think eventually it will change, and eventually that will go as well. But when you're choosing your targets, they're choosing whatever's most strategic at the moment to use the weapons that they have at the moment. But I'm sure the Kerch Bridge will see its end eventually. I'll just add quickly that I think it's wrong of us to think of this as Putin's war. Putin is leading the war, but this is Russia's war. And I think whether it's because of his brainwashing or his propaganda, but the men that are raping, pillaging, destroying are doing it, he's not coming and doing that. What you saw in Bucha was not done by Putin's hands, it was done by Russian soldiers. When you think about the children that are being kidnapped, who have parents, and being adopted by Russians, they're doing that knowing those children are Ukrainian. And I think it's too much to count on that there will be a regime change that somehow changes what is centuries of Russian colonial history towards Ukraine, towards Crimean Tatars. I think we can all hope for that, but we can't count on it, and we can't place this all on Putin. The Russian people are supporting him.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to my wonderful panelists. And thank you, Beth, for making such a wonderful film. Slava Ukraini.